It is a great pleasure to welcome you all to the third annual Global Human Rights Symposium.
The Human Rights Fellowship emerges from a broader human rights initiative at Gallatin, attempting to link human rights practice with academic work in human rights.
Hi everyone, my name is Anna Callaghan and I'm a graduate student in Arts and Sciences and I'm studying International Relations and Journalism. I spent the summer in Sarajevo, Bosnia and Herzegovina, working at the Organized Crime and Corruption Reporting Project and exploring the realm of freedom of information. Just a little tidbit, if you don't know where Bosnia is, as a lot of people don't, I found. It's right next to Croatia, which I'm sure you've heard of, north of Montenegro, next to Serbia as well. A brief summary about the country. After a war in the early 90s of ethnic cleansing and genocide, the government became a three-person presidency. So 3 presidents at one time share the presidency for 4 years and rotate every 8 months. So that gives you kind of an image of what government might be like and the gridlock you might encounter. So I spent 3 months at OCCRP as a reporting fellow where I worked with other investigative reporters. My project centered around freedom of information and in a much broader sense, how spreading knowledge and information unfettered by political agendas or self-interest can improve society, especially ones in the post-war context. And to me, I'll also use a quote that's kind of shaped the reason why I applied for this fellowship and shaped my summer and my studies, is best illustrated through a quote by Hitler that highlights the importance of having a community that is actively interested in learning and exposing truths and bettering society by doing so. So Hitler's self-proclaimed mission was merciless physical destruction of the enemy, and he justified it this way. He said, "Who, after all, speaks today of the annihilation of the Armenians?" My point there are things like crime and corruption and kind of atrocious things like this paralyze societies, especially in vulnerable post-war states. So the concept of freedom of information itself and the principles behind it can help combat this. So the organization I worked with is an award-winning American nonprofit, many awards for investigative journalism and the work that they have done. And they operate in many countries, from Eastern Europe to the Caucasus and Central Asia. And their goal is to help people understand how crime and corruption impacts their lives. And the organization, like many journalism organizations do, serves as a watchdog, informing the public through journalistic investigations and producing databases for people and cases of interest for the public. And their coverage spans from money laundering and fraud to drug trafficking and political corruption, anything like that. And the work that they do has a ripple effect. Last year, they published a series on Sergei Magnitsky. You might have heard of him. He's been in the news lately. The Russian lawyer who was accused of the tax fraud he exposed and who later died in prison. A few weeks ago, U.S. attorneys used the information from the stories that OCCRP reported to seize property in New York City, a bunch of expensive Wall Street apartments. So that kind of gives you an idea of just the kind of impact that this organization can have. Me personally, I worked on stories about the illegal trade in organs, which is a big problem in Eastern Europe. A lot of the rings run through Eastern Europe, and a lot of the people who are victims of organ trafficking reside there. So I worked on pieces about organ trafficking in the broad sense and about the illegal trade in kidneys, and got to do a fun story about selling my kidney on Facebook, which is easier than you might think. Their basic goal is to develop a culture of and expectation of free information in open society, which doesn't quite exist yet. Freedom of information is defined as the right to access information held by public bodies and recognized by the United Declaration of Human Rights and the UN General Assembly. And today, 93 countries have some kind of freedom of information regime in place. But the issues mainly are the extent and to which that's implemented, enforced, and to what extent the press is actually free. Filing these freedom of information requests is essentially the same in Bosnia as it is in the US. It has to be in writing. The body has 2 weeks to reply. Usually in the US, they'll at least give you a no. The reporters I talked to had a pretty low success rate in Bosnia. Perhaps 3 of 5 were granted, and most of them went totally ignored. So the investigative reporters have to develop other sources of information for this purpose, and it's pretty tricky. That Bosnian war in the early 90s pitted 3 groups against each other: the Bosnian Muslims, the Catholic Croats, and the Orthodox Serbs. Around 100,000 people were killed, and 8 times that fled the country. So the rich ethnic diversity that was once celebrated in the country became a death sentence. So a society that lived in relative coexistence saw friends and neighbors turn on one another, And a major tactic to manipulate the population during those 3 years was to spread propaganda and misinformation through the media, and it was incredibly effective, and it led people to not trust the media, even today. OCCRP is pretty much the only independent media body in the entire country, which definitely creates a problem in people's perspective on the industry and what they trust in these reports coming from anywhere. So that's kind of why it's important and why it's difficult in Bosnia, and it's also a very crucial goal for development. This is the first time that Bosnia has had a political system that resembles a democracy, and they need a free media to help them understand and participate in it. One of the major problems are numerous corrupt politicians, which can be expected, but they're voted in every term, the same people, and then people complain about it. So they haven't quite grasped, a lot of people are saying, the concept that they have a role to play and that they can participate. I mean, they've had dictators for the past where they've had no choice. So having a choice now is something that they need to be educated about. Freedom of information, like other rights, faces problems of implementation and enforcement, especially because it's hard to translate it meaningfully in every culture, especially when politics and norms kind of behave in opposition like they do in Bosnia. It's also less concrete in terms of a pragmatic evaluation and looking at the deliverables. You could look at the number of requests that were made or granted, and a society itself can be judged on how free and open it is, but there are a lot of inputs for freedom of information like safety and risk to journalists, independence of the media, and corruption that are also part of the bigger picture. There's an inherent tension here because it's often in the state's interest to mute freedom of the press, because a free press can undermine control of the political agenda, which is very much in the hands of the politicians now. So freedom of information and progress toward a just and open society run on a parallel track with government and legal institutions. And in order to show tangible progress, especially in Bosnia, the government and the press must work together, which will take a great number of years. Personally, as a journalist, the only thing I can advocate for without creating a conflict of interest is freedom of information, as it informs my own work, and I definitely saw that in practice, the ability of these journalists to do their jobs. While they're the only independent media, they weren't necessarily getting in trouble, besides maybe death threats from the people that they wrote about, by the government for doing what they did. So kind of what I also took away is something that I can keep doing, because while I was in Sarajevo, I researched and reported my graduate thesis, which uses the 1984 Olympics. It's a billboard that still stands from it, as a lens to kind of looked at the city's trajectory and what happened when the Olympics got dragged into this kind of green paradise that's also a political fault line. So I can pass that along when I finish it, but it was a great 3 months and I loved it. So thank you.